The section verses 8 through 11 that I have titled Judah's Rebellious Attitude. And in verse 8, he's told by God to write this in a table or tablet and a notebook, basically to write this down, that they are verse 9, a rebellious people, a people who are refusing to hear God's word, that tell the prophets, don't prophesy right things, prophesy things that they want to hear. That's really what they wanted. And we've been spending a great deal of time with all of these because they have such application to today. But verse 11 concludes this section when he tells them, get you out of the way, or they tell Isaiah, get you out of the way, turn aside out of the path, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. So here Israel is telling Isaiah, stop hindering us in doing what we want to do. Now he was hindering them by telling them that it's sinful, that it is contrary to God's law, that they're going to be destroyed if they don't stop, and so forth. So by telling them that, he was hindering them because they wanted to do those things. So they tell him, stop acting as a true prophet of God. True prophets of God would fearlessly proclaim God's message, which in this case is described as the path. And they're telling him, turn aside from it. I think it's interesting here. They say, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. I don't know if you've noticed as we've gone through Isaiah, that phrase, the Holy One of Israel, is possibly, if not his favorite term, it's one of his favorite terms for God. Now then, they're using it in derision. They don't want to hear about God and his ways or their sin. And so they, in derision, use this term that Isaiah has continually used, the Holy One of Israel. Just stop telling us about it. They don't want to hear about God. They want to be free of him. Our society as a whole, or maybe I should say the leaders of our society, decades back decided they wanted to be free of God. They used this phraseology, freedom of religion, as being free from religion. And that's what they wanted. And so they started bringing lawsuits getting into those states and from a national standpoint, those offices which could prevent anything about God. And so now then it's gotten to the point of the ridiculous as far as mentioning God. I remember a few years back, I believe it was in Colorado, a teacher had a Bible on his desk. They fired him. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't even open it, didn't anything. But because he had it on his desk, they fired him. They claim, of course, that was promoting a religion.
He didn't try to bring a lawsuit about them firing him?
I believe he did try and sue them, but and I don't know whatever happened as far as the outcome. But that doesn't really pertain to the desire and what we see in our society. It is keep religion, keep God totally out of our society.
It says in Psalms 2:4, he that sitteth in the heavens will laugh, the Lord will have them in derision.
Okay. And a better passage to use right now as to what we're discussing would be Psalm 53 and verse 1. Also Psalm 14, verse 1. Same thing. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God, because to many, I've heard it explained from that actually means no God for me. They're not denying the existence of God, but they don't want God. They don't want his lifestyle. They don't want anything about him. That's these people here. Cause your God to cease from before us. Don't put him before us. Don't put him in front of us. Don't tell us anything about it, about him, or about his righteousness, his law, our sin, or our wickedness, or anything else. We don't want to hear it. That happened decades ago, we're now seeing the effects of in our society too. While the majority of Americans believe in God, that is, they believing that God exists, if you try to tell them what the Bible actually says, they don't want to hear that. They don't care about those things. They want to live their life as they want to live it. They want to do what they want to do, and don't bring, they would put it, your God in front of us or before us, using the language here in Isaiah. Sadly, we've even got some in the church like that. In most congregations, started discussion on, is it sinful to drink a little bit? Drink alcohol? What about going home and having a beer after work? Is that all right? And see what you find. Because the majority of congregations are going to accept it. They would look at you as some weirdo saying that was sin. They don't want to hear God's message about it.
Don't look at it when it gives its color in a cup.
Well, that's why I used on one person, because it says don't even look upon it. As long as you close your eyes when you drink it, you'll be all right. course, that was said obviously tongue-in-cheek, but you're right, you'd have to look at to drink it. But that's not the point. Whether it's sin or not, they don't want to hear that it's sin. We're assuming right now that everyone would agree that it is sinful. If you don't, then we have another discussion. But I think everyone here would agree with such. But most congregations, you won't find that. You would find probably the majority saying that there's nothing wrong with it. We have the same thing. Members of the church who don't tell us what it says, don't explain it to us. And I've had that discussion on whether social drinking is just drinking a little bit is all right, or whether it's sin with preachers in the Lord's church.
How do you be sober with have that hard liquor in yourself?
Because they argue that the Bible condemns drunkenness. It does not condemn drinking in moderation, as they would put it. That these people, as we see today, want to be free of God because they don't want the restrictions that God has placed upon man. One of the major advocates of evolution, this is Darwinian evolution when it first started, he at least admitted that the reason they wanted evolution to be true is because they did not want to be conformed or limited, and he said in the area of sexuality, to what God says. Now, that's not the way he put it, but that's what he said. They don't want to be limited in that area. So what? Well, we'll eliminate God and we'll teach evolution. And so in our schools, evolution is taught as fact, when in reality it's not even a hypothesis. It would be a hypothesis. It is not even a theory. And it would be a bad hypothesis to begin with. But that's from a scientific standpoint. You have to have a hypothesis, you study it and test it to find, and it will become a theory, and then that theory is continued to you test it and examine it to see if it can be falsified before it becomes a fact. Well, evolution is a poor hypothesis. But we teach it today as fact, and as a result, we've eliminated God. And by eliminating God, you eliminate morality, right and wrong, and we see the effects of what has taken place decade after decade now in our school systems with those people growing up, and now then we're seeing the effects of it in our society. Okay, Dale.
I don't see why we have to get in the weeds with them and discuss that malarkey anyway. I mean, you got butterflies, hummingbirds.
And they won't even pay any attention to that.
Well, there's no way they.
Yeah.
They're nuts. They're nuts to reject all that design back.
Okay. the effects of teaching that man is nothing but an animal, though, is seen. Young, in his commentary, correctly points out, when truth is no longer proclaimed, the God of truth disappears from the hearts of men. This is, let me get it right. This it was that the people desired. They wanted God to disappear from their life. And should I say, in our nation, our society, along with a lot of other nations today, ours is no different. Ours might not even be as bad as many of the others. God has disappeared from the hearts of men. And definitely the God of the Bible has disappeared from the hearts of men. Now, why I put it that way is they have a view of God that is of their own making. You have God that is revealed in the Bible. Well, they believe God, but it's a God of their own making. Their view of God. It's not what God has revealed about himself. And I would say that even their own view of God is disappearing from the hearts of many people today. Carl.
Darwin's theory of evolution says that one kind changes to another kind. All you got to do is ask them for one example. There's not one single evidence of one kind changing to another kind. None.
Very few, that's why very few believe in Darwinian evolution today. So you're asking that question becomes a moot point because they don't even believe that. Darwin, when he wrote Origin of the Species, yes, he thought that through time, archaeological discoveries would discover those missing links. We talk about missing link, but there are thousands of them. Archaeology never discovered them. Thus, the majority of people changed from natural selection, likened to that, to, I like the term best, hopeful monster theory. That's what it's been labeled. I don't remember, and the reason I use that is because I don't remember the full name of it. But it's basically saying mutations took place.
Punctuated equilibrium.
Okay, punctuated equilibrium. That's it. I remembered the equilibrium part. I didn't remember the punctuated part. Most who believe in evolution would accept that. The problem with that is mutations are not helpful. They're harmful. Then what they do not recognize is that you have to have not just one mutation. You would have to have two mutations. It would have to be at the same time, and it would have to be in the same location. If you had a mutation that took place here in our landmass as opposed to over in the Russian landmass, no way to get those mutations together to where they would be able to reproduce in that mutated way. But mutations are bad. I have argued that those are only two mechanisms for evolution. I did not intend to get on the subject of evolution, but those are the only two mechanisms for evolution, and neither one of them can take place. If you don't have a mechanism for evolution, you cannot have evolution itself.
All these creatures are going to be simultaneously male and female, evolving simultaneously. All the monkey does like a hand glove. Ain't none of them can answer that. They just tongue-tied and stutter and do all of stuff and tell them that.
Dale, the problem isn't that. The problem is that they do not want God. And that takes us back to this verse. They didn't want God in their life. These people do not want God, and so they are going to believe evolution. It doesn't matter how much you try to reason with them. They want evolution because they want to live like they want to live. They want to do the things they want to do. And sadly, that's the way far too many are, even in the church. Verses 12 through 17 then is that Israel, I entitled it, Israel will pay for her sins. In verse 12, he says, "Wherefore thus saith the Holy One of Israel, because ye despised this word, and trusted in oppression and perverseness, and stay thereon." Went too far. Andrew, would you get that back to chapter 30 and verse 12? He can do it easier than I can. In verse 11, they talked about or used this term that Isaiah uses for God, Holy One of Israel. They used it in derision. So what does Isaiah do? He goes right back and uses it again. The phrase that they hate. And that's why they used it in derision. They don't want to hear it anymore. So what does he do? He makes them hear it again. And says, he's the one who's speaking. Thus saith the Holy One of Israel. So this one you don't want to hear, this one that you despise and hate, that name that you despise, he's the one who's speaking now. Isaiah, as we had seen, has accused Israel of despising or rejecting the Word of God. That is the word that Isaiah was proclaiming, which was from God. Instead, Israel had trusted in those who oppressed them. When we look at and trust in oppression and perverseness, there's three ideas that are given regarding this oppression. The first is that the oppressive methods that are used to finance the sending of tribute to Egypt. You know, that they had gotten together a bunch of money and treasures, and they were going to go to Egypt. They had sent an ambassador to Egypt to get Egypt to come and help them against the Assyrians. So it was the oppressive methods that they used to get those treasures. A second idea of trust in oppression and perverseness is that they see it as the oppressive methods used and especially this would be used by the leaders of the people, to silence the prophets. Now, go back to that last section. They're saying to the prophets, prophesy not unto us right things, prophesy deceits, tell us smooth things. The oppressive methods used to try to silence them. The third is idea that's presented is that it is the disposition of character that manifests itself in both of the first two ideas. Perverseness is very simply a deviation from the right way and an obstinate will. They are rebellious children. They have an obstinate will. They don't want to do what God says. They want to do their own thing. This is especially manifested in their trusting and relying upon Egypt instead of God. God had continually told them, He had demonstrated throughout their history, trust in me, you can rely on me, I'll be your rock, I will spare you, I will protect you, I will, these nations that come against you, I will destroy them if you will trust in me. What did they do? They trusted in these nations instead. If you turn back to Isaiah 28 and verse 15. It says, because ye have said, we made a covenant with death, and with hell are we at agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. A covenant with death. What is it? Well, that death was going to Egypt and asking their protection against Assyria. It was going to lead them to death, not save them. Egypt, even as the Sennacherib's general stood before Jerusalem and said, Egypt's like a broken arrow that if you trust in him, he'll pierce your hand through. Well, he was right, because Egypt couldn't help, and that's what he was saying. Egypt can't help you. They should have relied upon God, but they didn't. They stayed. The idea of stay would be they trusted in these others instead of trusting in God. They leaned upon Egypt instead of leaning upon God. There's a gradation or a increasing of intensity here, in that they do not merely trust in these things, but then it goes beyond that to they lean upon them for their support. That's we often discuss the nature of sin and how that it is progressive in nature. Psalm 1:1 describes it real good. Blessed is a man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. And you see the progression. He's walking, then he's standing, and then he's sitting. And it gets worse with each step. That's the nature of sin, though. You allow sin within your heart. At first, it might be something small that we think is unimportant. But when we first start harboring that, then it progresses to get worse and worse, and more things come into being because we have stopped trusting in God, and now then we're saying it's all right. We're refusing to hear His will about it. And then we go to the point where we start trusting in those things instead of trusting in God. They were trusting in oppression and perverseness instead of trusting in God. They leaned upon that for their support instead of leaning upon God for support. It becomes a sad situation for them. In verse 13, thus, therefore this iniquity shall be to you as a breach ready to fall, swelling out in a high wall, whose breaking cometh suddenly at an instant. This is the announcement of punishment, while verse 12 in particular was the ground for it, or the basis for it. You're trusting in oppression and perverseness and leaning upon it. As a result of that, therefore, what does Paul say about it? You look back and see what's before it, because it's a conclusion. Well, because you did this in verse 12, here's the result. The announcement of punishment. The image is a wall that's there. And that wall has a huge bulge or a breach in it. And you can, if you look at it, you can see it's not long till that thing's coming down. You just know it's going to happen because the way in which it's doing now, because of that bulge that's in it. It's going to give way. And when it gives way, it's going to cause, in reality, the downfall of the whole wall. All of it's going to be gone. The higher the wall, the greater the danger. If you have a little bitty wall, that's high, it's not going to cause much damage. If you have one that's a wall or that's 50 foot high, and that thing comes down, you're talking about a whole different matter then. More danger. What, Dale?
They can't move, some of them, because arrows are flying everywhere from the enemy, and they know that they're in a rock and a hard place. If they move, they're liable to be killed by the arrow, but if they don't move, the wall is going to crush them. And it's a waste of sinner's death, basically, is the idea. When you think about it, reason about it.
Okay. This is just describing the wall and the destruction that's coming. But the higher the wall, the greater the destruction, and the more complete the destruction is going to be. And we know that by looking at this bulge in a wall that it could come down at any time. And what do? We try and avoid it. We try and stay as far away from it as possible because it could come down when we're right there next to it, because it could happen at any time. That's the idea that this sin that they are involved in is to them. It's ready to fall. It's swelling out. And its destruction could come at any time. Instead of building upon a firm foundation, the firm foundation being God and His Word, they have built upon a foundation of lies. Again, go back to Isaiah 28:15. We've made a covenant with death. With hell we are at agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us, for we have made lies our refuge. And under falsehood have we hid ourselves. Their refuge was in lies. That was their foundation, based wholly upon lies. Foundation for their life, their foundation for everything. They had used their own standard in building a wall for national security, and that standard was about to be destroyed. When it's destroyed, their national security is destroyed. How many build a foundation today upon their own standard and reject the only sure foundation that we have? In Matthew the 7th chapter, as Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount, how does He end it? It's a little kid's song. That teaches a great lesson. Wise man building his house upon the rock, as opposed to the foolish man who built his house upon the sand. What is the foolish man? Foolish man, he's the one who doesn't build upon the good foundation. He builds upon his own foundation. There is no foundation in sand. And thus, the house is destroyed when the rains and winds come. That's the troubles of life that is being illustrated there. And his house falls because it has no good foundation. But I think it's interesting in that the wise man built his house upon, it doesn't just say a rock. It says, and it's very specific, upon the rock. What is the rock? That's what the sermon was about Sunday. Or was that the Bible class, I guess, Sunday? In relationship, was the church founded upon Peter being the rock, or upon Jesus being the Christ, the Son of the living God? Well, obviously it's upon Christ. And as Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 11, other foundation can no man lay than that which was laid, which is Christ Jesus. There's the foundation. There's the rock that gives us a good, solid foundation. But today we have, as a whole or as a people, have forsaken that to build our life upon our own standards. When you get into a study of philosophy, that's probably almost a dirty word to a lot of people. It's not. It's just a study of the thinking of man and what he bases his standards upon, and looking at man and his stand. Well, philosophy also gives and sets forth standards, and so it's a good study. Our philosophy should be Jesus Christ and building upon that solid foundation. But the philosophies of man is where we get into problems. There's the foundation, or really the lack of foundation of, and what it all boils down to is wanting to do what our own selves want, doing what causes or brings the most pleasure in life. What are your goals in life? Well, to make a lot of money. Well, thus, if that's the goal in life, if you cheat someone, what difference does it make? One person said that our philosophy should be that of greed. Argued that greed was the philosophy that we should live by. That was a philosopher by the name of Ayn Rand. She's dead now and knows better. But think of that for a minute. Greed? And that's what everyone should base their life upon? Greed? What a miserable lifestyle and what a miserable society we would have if that's the main thing that we're thinking about, and everything is pointing toward what I can get it for myself.
It's already bad now.
Well, it is, and it's only going worse. Again, that's because we've left God out of the picture. And I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I would predict that before long our nation as a nation is going to be destroyed because of the wickedness and the ungodliness that we see in our society, the lack of any accountability. There's a lot of problems that our society has. And it's because we've eliminated God and built upon a foundation of sand. We'll start then, Lord willing, it next time in verse 14.